episode of Rai Vision Reflections. I'm Satish Rai. Today I continue with my series on Doctrine of Discovery, and today I'll be talking about another issue that I find very interesting. Today, I'll be talking about the factors which drove the Europeans to start colonization of the peoples of color in the 15th century. This is the second reason, which is the construction of long voyage ships. The long period of war in Europe, the peoples of Western Europe traveled across the sea to invade and wage wars in Greenland and what is now called the UK. It has been proven that the Vikings were the first Europeans who had traveled to North America well before Columbus's fateful landing in the Caribbean in 1492. It is not hard to imagine that by that time, Europe had set their eyes towards the lands of people of color. They had developed ships which could travel long distance over the seas. Another major reason why the Europeans started to colonize the people of color in the 15th century was because of the blocking of the trade routes to India. One of the main reasons for the European voyages to the east, which eventually led to the conquest of the lands of people of color, was to find an alternative route to India. The conquest by the Islamist Ottoman Empire of the Christian Byzantine Empire, especially the city of Constantinople in Anatolia, had blocked the lucrative spice trade route to India. It was imperative that an alternative route to India had to be found from the Eastern European countries. The only alternative route was by sea. Vasco da Gama eventually found this route by traveling east. However, in his wisdom or lack of it, Christopher Columbus decided to travel west to find India. Instead, he chanced upon an island in the Caribbean, which he assumed to be India and called the natives Indians. The rest, as they say, is history. A history that started genocide of millions of Native Americans, the slavery, occupation of their lands, and enslavement, transportation, and exploitation of millions of Africans and Irish people who had dared to fight the English occupation of Ireland. Another major factor was the threat of expansion of Islam to West Europe. Another reason why Spain was desperate to find new lands was because of the occupation by the Islamic Umayyad Empire of Christian Spain and Portugal, which were one country back in history. The Umayyad conquest had started in 711 in the current era, and it ruled the whole of the peninsula for some 780 years. The conquest resulted in the destruction of the Visigothic kingdom and the establishment of the Umayyad Walaya of Al-Andalus. The Christians eventually began to fight back, and eventually the last remaining Umayyad state of Granada in the south of the peninsula was defeated in 1492. Ironically, this is the year when the occupation by the Spain and Portugal of South America began. Now coming to European invasion and occupation of the land of people of color, I will give a brief introduction. This subject is very well covered on the digital global media platform today. It is therefore sufficient for me to provide only a brief synopsis of this topic as an illustration of how the Europeans had invaded and occupied the land of people of color all over the world for their own profit and to spread Christianity. The well-known wave of European colonization of the Americas took place between 1492 and 1800, what the European historians have described as the age of exploration. We now know the reason why the Europeans started their genocidal voyages to Americas, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India. From 1492, several European empires, primarily Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and Netherlands, began to invade and claim the land, natural resources, human capital of the Americas, resulting in the displacement, destabilization, enslavement, and genocide of indigenous people already there, and the establishment of the several settler colonial states. I will describe in more detail in my later works how South America was first split between Portugal and Spain. Portugal was given the east side of the continent and Spain the rest. Later, Britain, France, and Netherlands joined the loot of the South America. This was followed by the Britain and France battling out for the occupation of the east side of the North America and the country that we now know as Canada. By this time, the Spanish had traveled upwards and had occupied most of the east coast of North America. In the ensuing battle between the British occupiers and the Spaniards, the British were able to take most of the territory from the Spaniards in the North America, including northern part of Mexico. Between 1765 and 1791, the Americans in the 13 British colonies formed independent states that defeated the British in the American Revolutionary War that took place between 1775 and 1783. After gaining independence from the British Crown, they established a constitution that created the United States of America as we know today. However, what is less well known and acknowledged is that in order to progress from what the North and South America is today, so 50 million native population of the two continents were killed through jam and military warfare by the European invaders. Some of those who had somehow survived the genocides were enslaved, while others were confined to small pieces of their own land which is called reservations. The children were stolen from them, converted to Christianity, and made to ape the Western lifestyle instead of following their age-old tradition and cultures. Very similar methods were used by the Europeans when they occupied the vast continent of the original people into a country we now know as Australia. Declaration that the original inhabitants of Australia were subhuman. The land on which they had lived for some 60,000 years was terra nullius, that is empty. It justified the European genocide of the native population and claiming the original land as their own. Similar things had happened to the Maori people in New Zealand. I will demonstrate below how same thing had happened in Fiji, although the European historians and most historians even today do not see that as far as Fiji is concerned. They have painted a more humane version of the colonization of Fiji by Britain. I will show that Britain was a reluctant colonizer of Fiji, and it only did so because of the demands made by them, by those British people who were transported to Australia during the colonization of Australia. I will show how the natives of Fiji were dehumanized by the Australian settlers. Thousands were killed or enslaved, and their land was occupied by the Australian settlers for profit. Africa, too, was carved up and shared between European nations during what is now known as the Scramble for Australia, which is now known as the Scramble for Africa, also called the Partition of Africa or the Conquest of Africa. Quoting, it was the invasion, annexation, division, and colonization of most of the Africa between 1881 and 1914 by 7 Western European powers during a short period known as New Imperialism. The 10% of Africa that was under formal control in 1870 increased to almost 90% by 1914, with only Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and Liberia remaining independent, although Ethiopia was later to be invaded and occupied by Italy from 1936 to 1941. I will stop this episode here. In the next episode, I'll be talking about human trafficking of global people of color and European rebels and the poor. So until then, is goodbye from me. And please, if you are enjoying or getting some knowledge from these episodes, please share with others. Thank you very much. Goodbye.